Good evening. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Thursday, Yom HaMishi? Alyssa in Philadelphia, Karen in Northern California, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Tom, Yehudit in South Carolina, Carla in Brazil, Melissa in Great Neck Guy in Ohio, Stephen in New Hampshire, Tom in PA, Paula in Chicago, Shandora in the Bronx, Bella in Florida, Nancy in North Carolina. And then I caught up, okay. And Marjorie in Virginia. Sharon in New Jersey. Welcome, everybody. Our daf today is page 46 here in Tractate Kiddushin, the 20th volume of the Talmud. We're working our way through chapter 2 today, concluding our discussion of Mishnah number 1. And God willing, we'll open our discussion of Mishnah number 2. Mishnah number 1 has been all about agency and who can accept or give betrothal. And then we'll get into some further nuances in Mishnah number 2. Okay, so yesterday we were talking about what happens if a minor girl or if a young woman who needs the consent of her father in order to become betrothed and again to get married, what if she goes ahead and gets betrothed without his consent? So the Gemara cites another case, and we're picking this up at the bottom of 45b. If a minor, so she's less than 12 years old, became betrothed without the consent of her father, and she married also without his consent, and her father is here, right? Yesterday we had the case where the father betrothed, gave consent to her betrothal, but then he was out of the country and she went ahead and got married, or he was out of the country when she went ahead and got herself betrothed without his consent. But now we have the case where the father is here. So she could have got his consent and she didn't. Now, if he's here, why do we have a case? Because perhaps he hasn't said anything. He hasn't said that he approves the match. He hasn't said that he rejects the match. He has remained silent. So, if a minor became betrothed without the consent of her father and he married without his consent, and she married without his consent, and her father is here, present, available to us, so Rav Huna said she may partake of terumah, right? This is where she is the daughter of a Yisrael who's not permitted to eat terumah. Food is just consecrated only for the use of priests. But she betrothed herself and then married a priest, right? So she's a minor and now she's married to a priest without her father's consent. The father can object to this union and nullify the marriage, and then she won't be able to eat terumah. So if there's the possibility that the father could annul this marriage to a priest, which is what permits her to eat terumah, maybe we shouldn't let her eat terumah at all, even though she's married to him during the period of time before the father objects or ratifies this union, because he might reject it. So Rav Huna said she may partake of terumah during this period before the father speaks, and Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba said she may not partake of terumah. And Ula said this opinion of Rav Huna, that in this case she may partake of terumah, is irritating as vinegar to the teeth and as smoke to the eyes, taken from Proverbs 10:26. Pretty strong words from Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba talking about Rav Huna. Wow, what's wrong? And this is irritating as vinegar to the teeth or smoke in the eyes because it contradicts Rav Huna's own earlier ruling. Now consider, and what about there, i.e. in the case where her betrothal was with her father's consent, when there is at least betrothal by Torah law? So you said she may not partake of terumah in case he did not consent to the marriage, right? He consented to the betrothal, but he hasn't consented to the marriage. So is it not all the more so the case that here, where even the betrothal was performed without her father's consent, that she should not be permitted to partake of terumah? Now we're on 46a. So rather, the statement of the student seems reasonable. Although Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba was like a student compared with Rav Huna, his opinion makes more sense. And Rava said, Ula said that Rav Huna's opinion is like vinegar in the teeth. And now he's saying that the opinion of Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba is more reasonable, that she may not partake of terumah than Rav Huna's opinion that she may, right? So Ula, and we've seen Ula many times, Ula was known for being one of the sages who was mobile, right? And he would travel repeatedly back and forth between the community of sages in the Holy Land, which was under Roman occupation and where times were very difficult and often the sages' teaching had to be restrained, and the community of sages in Bavel, in Babylonia, where they had a lot more religious freedom. And that's why ultimately the Babylonian Talmud was completed. That's the one we're studying. And the Jerusalem Talmud was not completed because of the harsh decrees of the Roman Empire. Now, so says Ula, right? So let's just read that again. Rather, says Ula, the statement of the student seems reasonable. Although Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba was like a student compared with Rav Huna, his opinion makes more sense. So Rava said, what is the reason of Rav Huna? Since an action was done with her that renders her like an orphan in the lifetime of her father, she is considered married, and she may partake of terumah. The fact that her father ignored both her betrothal and her marriage, right? He's here, but he didn't consent, but he didn't object. He just remained silent, right? So this is what Rav is relying on. What is the reason of Rav Huna? Since an action was done with her that renders her like an orphan in the lifetime of her father, she's considered married and may partake of terumah. The fact that her father ignored both her betrothal and her marriage indicates that he has waived his rights to control whom she marries. It's like he waived his right. Now that she's become married, even if she becomes divorced and moves back in with her dad, he has lost the right to betroth her because she's already been married. That's what it means to become like an orphan in the lifetime of the father. So she is what I just said. So she is therefore considered like an orphan whose marriage is valid with her own consent. Okay. Now, before I read the next little topic, I'll just read where the law came out, and that'll help us as we read it. So this is the halakha. This is where the law came out in the discussion which follows. If a young woman, right, or a minor, betrothed herself without her father's consent before she became an adult, either she or her father can nullify the betrothal. Obviously, we know the father can nullify it, but she can also, because this wasn't a proper betrothal to begin with. A minor is not permitted to accept betrothal upon herself. She did it anyway, so it's easy to nullify, and either she or her father can nullify it. Then, with the case of the seducer that we're going to be talking about, right? So, although rapists and seducers are obligated to marry their victims, that's if the victim wants to be married, and obligated to marry means that now that he's raped her or seduced her, and she elects to be married to this guy, he can never divorce her, right? She can probably go to court and get a divorce if she wants out, but he has lost the right to divorce her because he raped her, and now he has a lifelong obligation to sustain her, to provide sustenance for her as his wife. This is perhaps the Talmudic equivalent of the shotgun wedding, except it's permanent, right? They can't get out of it later either. And it's not the Talmudic equivalent, it's the Torah equivalent, right? The Torah dictates this. Okay, with those two laws in mind, wait a minute. Although rapists and seducers are obligated to marry their victims, either the victim or her father can prevent the marriage from occurring, right? So it's her choice, and if she's a minor, it's her father's choice as well. The rapist has to marry her if that's what the young girl and the father want. But if either of them doesn't want it, then the marriage won't happen. Okay, so with regard to these laws, it was stated that Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara, disputed the following issue. In the case of a minor girl who became betrothed without her father's consent, Rav says either she or her father is able to prevent the betrothal from taking effect. And Rav Asi says her father can prevent it, but not she, since she initially agreed to this. So Rav Huna raised an objection to Rav Asi, and some say it was Chiya bar Rav who raised an objection to Rav Asi. The Baraisa states, in the case of a seduced woman, if her father refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money, according to the dowry of virgins. Exodus 22:16. And meaning the seducer will pay. The sages expounded, I have derived only the law that her father can refuse to give her to the seducer in marriage. From where do I derive that she herself can also refuse? The verse states, if he refuses, ma'en yema'en. And the repetition of the verb, right, this doubled verb, which we often translate, we see in an English translation, we see verily, right? If he refuses indeed, or if he refuses verily, or if indeed he refuses, right? But in Hebrew, when it's emphasized like this, the verb is doubled in biblical Hebrew. And that doubling is an opening for the sages to, interpret out another law, another aspect of the law. So the verse states, if he refuses, ma'en yema'en, and the repetition of the verb indicates that the right of refusal exists in any case. Despite the fact that she was seduced, she can change her mind and say that she does not want to marry the seducer. Rav said to those who tried to offer support for his opinion, do not go after the opposite, i.e. do not cite a proof from a source that could be understood in the opposite manner. Rav Asi can answer your argument by claiming that the Baraisa is referring to a case where he initially seduced her not for the sake of marriage. Their initial act of intercourse was not performed in order to effect betrothal. Recall that betrothal can be created either with giving her or her father money, or the equivalent of money, or giving her or her father a document of betrothal, or if they perform sexual intercourse with the intention of creating betrothal. So their initial act of intercourse was not, in this case that we're discussing, their initial act of intercourse was not performed in order to effect betrothal, so they are not betrothed. Now the Gemara questions this. In the case of a seduction that is not for the sake of marriage, is a verse required to teach that she can refuse to marry him? Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says it serves to say that if she refuses to marry him despite her father's consent to the match, the seducer nevertheless pays the fine like a standard case of a seduced woman. And the obligation to pay the fine is not only for a case where her father refuses to let her marry the seducer. Rav Yosef said to him, if so, if the Baraisa is discussing a case where intercourse was not performed to effect betrothal, well, then this is what we learned in a Baraisa with regard to a seduced woman. Exodus 22:15, he shall pay a dowry for her to be his wife. And this teaches that she requires betrothal from him. And if the verse is speaking of one who seduced her for the sake of marriage, why do I need betrothal? The act of intercourse can serve as the betrothal. Rather, the Baraisa must be referring to a case where he seduced her not for the sake of marriage. Abaye said to him, even if he seduced her for the sake of marriage, she nevertheless requires an additional betrothal with her father's consent because she is a minor and became betrothed without it. Right? And again, as always, this was said in a time where this was all of the law. In modern times, where we have, people live much shorter lives. But now, when we have laws, obviously prohibiting as rape, having sex with a minor, that's the statute, that's the law of the land. So Jews are bound to obey the law of the land. So that's why these cases don't come up. You don't marry a 12-year-old or even younger. But this was possible in ancient times. And now, if it was a rape or a seduction, there was also going to be other consequences. We're just dealing with, was a betrothal created? Is a get required to break it off? Is the father's consent required for it to proceed to marriage, etc.? That doesn't mean that these are the only laws involved, and it doesn't mean that the sages were not mindful of the terrible and difficult emotional issues involved. It's just that we're not discussing that aspect of those cases at this time. Okay, Mishnah number 2. In the case of one who says to a woman, be betrothed to me with this date. And he doesn't mean let's go on a date and get betrothed. It means here's one little piece of fruit from a date palm. I'm giving it to you so that we will be betrothed. Do you accept? So the question is, since you have to create betrothal, there has to be an exchange of something, right? Either he gives her money, or he gives her the equivalent of money, or he gives her a document, or they decide to sleep together in order to create betrothal, which was considered grossly inappropriate, possible, but frowned upon. So normally an object of value was given, and that object of value had to be worth at least 1 peruta. 1 date is not worth that minimum amount of 1 peruta. Peruta is like a penny, but 1 date is worth even less than that. So in the case of one who says to a woman, be betrothed to me with this date, and he adds, be betrothed to me with that one, then, in other words, with 2 dates, but 2 different, he said it twice, be betrothed to me with this date, and be betrothed to me with this date, right? So he's got 2 dates in his hand, and he said separately, be betrothed to me with each one of those. Not be betrothed to me with this and this, but be betrothed to me with this, be betrothed to me with this. Now, the idea here is that the 2 dates add up to the minimum value, but 1 does not. So what happened? Was a betrothal created or not? And he adds, be betrothed to me with that one. Then, if one of the dates is worth 1 peruta, she is betrothed. But if one of the dates by itself is not worth 1 peruta, then she is not betrothed, since he mentioned betrothal in connection with each date. You can't add them together. But if he said, be betrothed to me with this one, and with this one, and with this one, then even if all of them together are worth 1 peruta, she is betrothed. But if they don't add up, all of them to 1 peruta, then she is not betrothed. If he gave her dates with the intention of betrothing her with them, and she was eating them one by one as she received them, she is not betrothed unless one of them by itself is worth 1 peruta. That's Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 2. Now the Gemara, who is the Tana who taught that it is only if he says, be betrothed to me, in connection with each date, that each act of betrothal is considered distinct, and therefore each date has to have the value for it to happen, for the betrothal to happen, has to have the minimum value for the betrothal to happen. Rabbah says this is the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who said in the context of the laws of oaths of deposit, he is never liable to bring more than 1 offering unless he will state an expression of an oath to each and every one. And the Mishnah teaches if one said, with this one, and with this one, and with this one, right? See, he only said 1 statement of betrothal, and then he said with this one, and with this one, and this one, then we can add them together to create the value of 1 peruta. So if one said with this one, and with this one, and with this one, she is betrothed, even if all of them together only add up to 1 peruta. And the Mishnah subsequently states that if she was eating the dates one by one, she is betrothed only if one of them is worth 1 peruta. So the Gemara asks, to which clause of the Mishnah is the case of the woman eating the dates one by one referring? If we say it is referring to the first clause of our Mishnah, when he betrothed her separately with each date, why would the Mishnah specifically state that she ate them? Even if she placed them down without eating them, the same law would also apply. As he said, be betrothed to me with this date, so each date must be worth 1 peruta. So rather, this case of her eating them one by one must be referring to the latter clause of the Mishnah when he said that he is betrothing her with all the dates. In such a situation, if she ate them one by one, she is betrothed only if one of them is worth 1 peruta. So the Gemara proceeds to ask, and is she betrothed even if the first date is worth 1 peruta? But until he has given her all the dates for the betrothal, each individual date is considered to be like a loan, because if he were to retract his betrothal before giving her all of the dates, she would have to return them to him. And one cannot betroth a woman by giving her a loan. You must freely give the object of value. You can't loan it to her in order to create betrothal and then get it back from her. No, that doesn't work. And you understand that if he said, okay, listen, I'm going to be betrothed to me with these 4 dates that I'm going to give you. And then he starts giving her to them one by one. Now, even if the first one is worth the minimum value of 1 peruta, since he has said he's going to give her 4, then until he's given her all 4, he hasn't created betrothal. And if he were to change his mind and never give her the 4th one, the 3 that he already gave her, she has to give them back because they're considered a loan. I guess this would be a little bit similar, definitely not the same. As we've said many times, engagement in modern secular culture is not the same as betrothal under Jewish law. Betrothal, once it's created, requires a divorce to undo it. But still, it's a little bit akin to the idea that you give an engagement ring, and then if you don't get to the altar, does that engagement ring have to be given back? I think that's probably just an ethical question. There's no law about that. And I'm sure people would argue that, well, every case is different and it depends what's going on. But it's a little bit of a similar issue, right? That's all I'm saying. A little bit similar. Okay. But here the idea is, if he says, I'm going to betroth you with 4 dates, until he's given her all 4, the first 3 that he gives her are considered a loan, because if he never finishes, if he changes his mind and says, no, you know what, I'm not going to betroth you, then the 3 dates that he already gave her, she has to give them back because they're considered a loan according to this opinion. Okay, so let's see. Now, by the time he finishes giving her the dates, the first one, now what if she's eating them as she goes? So by the time he but because if he were to return, then one cannot betroth a woman by giving her a loan. So by the time he finishes giving her the dates, the first one has already been eaten, so it is not able to affect the betrothal. Now, with regard to this difficulty, Rabbi Yochanan says, there is a table, and there is meat, and there is a knife, and we have nothing to eat. In other words, everything in the Mishnah is explicit, and yet we cannot explain it. So Rav and Shmuel both said, actually, the case of the woman eating the dates one by one is referring to the first clause of the Mishnah, where one betrothed the woman with each date separately, and it is speaking utilizing the style of it is not necessary. The Mishnah stated for stylistic reasons a law that it did not need to state and should be understood as follows. It is not necessary to state the law in the case of a woman who placed the dates down, that if one of them is worth 1 peruta, yes, she is betrothed, and if not, she is not betrothed. But in a case where she was eating them, one might think that since her benefit is immediate, say that she has decided to transfer herself to him by means of that date, although it is worth less than 1 peruta. And the Mishnah therefore teaches us that she is nevertheless not betrothed. You might think that because she's eating them, she considers that she's engaged, she can just partake of it, it's not a loan, that's why she's eating it. But she might have made a mistake of law where she's thinking that, well, because they're all going to add up, the fact that he's making betrothed me with this one, betrothed to me with this one, betrothed to me with this one, she doesn't realize that means that each one has to be worth 1 peruta. So, she might be making a mistake of law, and if she is, then the fact that she thinks she's betrothed doesn't make her betrothed. Rabbi Ami said a different explanation. Actually, the case of the woman eating the dates one by one is referring to the latter clause of the Mishnah, where he betrothed her by giving her all of the dates. Be betrothed to me with this one, this one, this one, and this one. Like he says, I'm going to give you 4. And what is the meaning of unless one of them is worth a peruta? It means unless the last of them is worth 1 peruta. But if one of the other dates is worth 1 peruta, she is not betrothed, since they are considered a loan until all the dates have been given. Rava says, conclude 3 conclusions from this statement of Rabbi Ami. Conclude from it that in the case of one who betroths a woman with a loan, she is not betrothed, since she is not betrothed with a date that has already been eaten. And conclude from it that in the case of one who betroths a woman by forgiving a loan and giving her 1 peruta, her mind is focused on the peruta, even if the debt is far larger, and therefore she is betrothed. And in the latter case, although the value of the dates she ate was more than the value of the last date, which was merely worth 1 peruta, she is nevertheless betrothed. Now we're on 46b, and conclude from it that generally money that was given for a betrothal that did not take effect is returned. It is not viewed as a gift, but as a loan that must be repaid. That's the important takeaway. This is evident from the fact that all the dates except the last one are considered a loan that must be repaid, right? So in a maybe more realistic case, let's say that this young man negotiated with her father that, he wants to marry her. Okay, well, she's very, upper class. And he has to give money for this betrothal. Well, the minimum is 1 peruta, but the father can negotiate for whatever he wants. So he says, you want to marry my daughter? You give my family 5,000 dinars, an extraordinary amount of money. So the boy says, okay, got it. I can't get that together all at once. And the father said, no problem. You give me 1,000 this month and 1,000 next month and 1,000 a month for 5 months, and then you'll be betrothed. So, okay, the boy starts to work super hard, borrow money, get his family to raise the money, whatever he needs to do. He pays 1,000 dinars the first month, the second month, the third month, the fourth month. And at this point, he's cooled off. And he's like, you know what? I'm making my family bankrupt. It's not worth it. I don't love her that much. I'm out. Right? So he doesn't want the betrothal anymore. The money that he's already paid to her father must be returned to him because it's considered a loan to her or to her father until the betrothal is complete. And now that there won't be a betrothal, the boy wants out, all that money has to be returned. That's what we just learned. 46b. It was stated in the case of one who betroths his sister. Betroths his sister? Can you marry your sister? No, of course not. So this is one of these hypothetical cases that the sages are using to prove a point. It was stated in the case of one who betroths his sister by giving her money, Rav says the money of the betrothal must be returned by his sister, as this betrothal cannot take effect. And Shmuel says the money is considered to be a gift that she may keep. What? The betrothal won't take effect. How is it that she can keep the money? The Gemara clarifies their respective opinions. Rav says the money must be returned because a person knows that betrothal does not take effect with your sister, and he decided to give the money to her for the sake of a deposit. The Gemara raises a difficulty. Well, then let him explicitly say to her that he is giving her the money for the sake of a deposit. Hold on to this for me and keep it safe. The Gemara answers, he thought she would not accept it from him. So he's trying to create a situation where she can watch his money for him and she'll have to give it back. So he's trying to be clever and says, you know what, be betrothed to me, and here's the money. And his sister's like, oh, okay, I guess we're going to get married. Or maybe she is kind of, an educated Torah scholar too, and she's like, oh, well, I know that if betrothal doesn't take effect, the money has to be returned. So it must be that he's just depositing it with me. I get it. I'm in the know. So according to Rav, that would work. But according to Shmuel, no. Since they know that that this betrothal won't work and he's giving her money anyway, what he really meant to do is give her a gift and she doesn't have to return it. Shmuel maintains the money is considered a gift because a person knows that betrothal does not take effect with his sister and he decided to give the money to her for the sake of a gift. So the Gemara raises a difficulty. Well, then he should have explicitly said to her that he's giving her the money for the sake of a gift. And the Gemara answers he thought it would be embarrassing to her to take a gift and she would refuse to accept the money. So he therefore attempted to give it to her by an alternative method, right? Who would do that? Like, you wouldn't use this kind of weird legal device in order to create a gift. If she was so embarrassed to accept it, he would find some anonymous way to get it to her. We're really just testing our understanding of the law. Ravina raises an objection from a Mishna in Chala, right? So there's not a tractate called Chala in the Talmud, in the Gemara, but there is a tractate called Chala in the Mishnah. And it's about Chala. Reminder, in case anybody forgot, Chala is the word we use now to refer to the beautiful, tasty egg bread that we eat on Friday nights when we have 2 loaves of it for Shabbos dinner. But the word challah, the only reason that bread is called that is because when it's made, by a pious person, they're going to remove, at the stage at which the challah is being made, when it is in the form of dough, they're going to remove some of that dough. When the temple was standing, that dough that was removed would be given to a priest as a gift. Now that the temple is not standing, we remove the dough and we put it aside, and it's disposed of, according to some the halacha of baking challah. We don't have to go into that now. But it is kind of interesting to me, and this is what the Torah says, that you shall give from the dough of your bread to the priest, right? And it's interesting that, and this is coming now in the discussion, you can't separate flour, right? Let's say you have enough flour that you're going to bake some loaves of bread. Okay, well, it might be more useful to the priest to give him the amount of dough that would be in the challah portion as a cup of flour, and then he could put it in his cupboard. No, you don't do that. Maybe it would be better for the priest to just actually give him bread, So let's say I'm going to bake 50 loaves. So I don't remember what the exact, percentage of the total amount of dough that becomes the challah. But maybe you could, if you were making sufficient numbers of loaves of bread, you could give a whole loaf of bread to the priest. But that is not what the Torah says. You give to the priest at the stage of dough. Right? That's a kindness to you, so that you can give him a ball of dough. You're not going to give him a partial loaf or a partial piece of bread. That's also a kindness to the priest, but it cannot be done at the stage of flour. So, it's probably just a hook. It's one of these laws that we do it because God said so. But if we try to think what is the reason, it makes you mindful. Wow, we're so blessed. We're going to have bread. We have the opportunity to bake bread in our home. And it is this time I want to show my gratitude to God by separating a portion, as the Torah instructed me to do, and give, to God's priests, the Kohanim. Okay, so at any rate, here this is being brought up because of this idea that if you betroth your sister, that betrothal won't take effect. So what happens to that money? So in trying to understand that principle, they're going to say something now from the law of challah and the idea that people know, right? And so if they give it anyway, despite knowing that they're doing something improper, what is it that they're really trying to do? So Ravina raises an objection from a Mishna in Challah 2:5. In the case of one who separates his challah, the portion of dough that must be given to a priest, from flour, right? He should have separated from the dough. Instead, he's trying to take that amount from the flour before he makes it into dough. So then this portion that he has separated is not challah. Whatever you might call it might be a gift for the priest out of your flour, but is not challah. Since the Torah states, Numbers 15:20, of the first of your dough you shall set apart, challah can be separated only from dough. And if the priest fails to return the flour, it is considered stolen property in the priest's possession. Ravina asks, and why is it stolen property in the priest's possession? In this case too, let us say as Shmuel does, a person knows that one cannot separate challah from flour, and he gave the flour for the sake of a gift. The Gemara answers, not so quick. There it is different. The priest must return the flour, because otherwise a ruinous situation may emerge from it. How so? Sometimes the priest has, on his own, less than 5/4 of a kav of flour. This is the minimum amount where if you're making that much bread, you're going to have to take out challah. Sometimes the priest has, on his own, less than 5/4 of a kav of flour, i.e. he has less than the amount necessitating the separation of challah, and he also has this flour, which gives him a total of more than 5/4 of a kav, the amount which necessitates the separation of challah. Now, he will need all this flour together, and he will think that his dough has been made ready with regard to challah, since he did not have enough of his own flour to require the separation of challah, and he had added flour that had been separated as challah to it. And he will then come to eat it in its untithed state, as the flour he received was not in fact challah. Therefore, the sages required him to return the flour. It's a very complicated hypothetical, but one thing you learn from it, just as Levites receive tithes, and from the tithes that they receive, they have to tithe and give to a priest. Here we learn that just as all Jews, right, who are not priests, when they make enough bread, a sufficient quantity of bread, have to separate challah, and when the temple is standing, they give that to a priest. Well, then when the priest is making his own challah, he too has to separate challah. Okay, and I guess he gives it to a fellow priest. So the Gemara asks, but wait a minute, didn't you say that a person knows that one may not separate challah from flour? How can the priest make such an error? And the Gemara answers, he knows the law, but he does not know the reason for the law. He knows that one cannot separate challah from flour, but he does not necessarily know the reason. In fact, he might think, what is the reason one may not separate challah from flour is due to the labor of the priest, i.e. to prevent the priest from having to knead it himself. And as far as the labor of the priest goes, he thinks, I have relinquished the right to have the non-priest knead it for me. Right? He might not realize, not every priest is such a Torah scholar, he might not realize that the reason that challah has to be separated from dough and not from flour is because the Torah says so. And he might think that actually it's just done, as a benefit to me, and I give up my right to that benefit. I'll be happy to take the flour instead of the dough. But if he receives flour, thinking that he and the giver both think that it's challah, both of them would be wrong. Now the Gemara asks a question based on a comparison to a similar case. But why must the priest go to the effort of returning the flour to its owner? Let the separated flour be considered terumah. Right? Terumah is a gift that you have to give from produce to a priest anyway. So okay, if he receives flour from this person, let's not call it challah. It's not challah. Challah is only from the dough, not from the flour. But why can't it be terumah? If it's terumah, it belongs to the priest. He doesn't have to return it. Why does he have to go to the trouble of returning it? Let the separated flour be considered terumah by rabbinic, and then it could be challah by rabbinic law. And it should not, let the separated flour be considered terumah by rabbinic law, and it should not be eaten by the priest until he removes challah from it somewhere else in order to make it ready to be eaten. Didn't we learn in the Mishna, Demai 5:10, if one separated terumah from produce grown in a perforated pot, which is obligated in terumahs and tithes by Torah law for produce that had grown in a non-perforated pot, which is not obligated in terumahs and tithes according to Torah law, although the separating of terumah did not take effect and the putative terumah is still untithed produce, it is considered to be terumah and remains in the possession of the priest, and it may not be eaten until he removes terumah and tithes from it from somewhere else, i.e. the same halakha should apply. So therefore, the same halakha should apply in the case of the challah. Complicated analogy, but in short, if produce that comes out of the ground, when you harvest it, and the temple is standing, and so we're tithing, so if it's grown from the ground, you have to tithe it. If it's grown in a pot that has holes in the bottom so that the roots of the plant in the pot can go into the ground, then it's considered like it grew out of the ground. If it grew in pots that don't have holes at the bottom of the pot, well, then it didn't come out of the ground. It came out of soil that's in a pot. And it is not obligated to be tithed, at least by Torah law. And so they're asking, can you tithe on behalf of food that is obligated to be tithed, like it grew in a perforated pot, from food that was grown in a non-perforated pot and is not obligated to be tithed? Whole other question. But at any rate, the point is that even though there might be different levels of obligation, once it's given to the priest, if we can find the justification for not making the priest have to go to the trouble of returning it, it would be better. Can't we apply that principle to this challah that was mistakenly separated at the stage of flour rather than at the stage of dough when it was given to the priest? And the Gemara answers, with regard to things that are in two separate containers, the priest will listen. Since the priest is well aware of the difference between a perforated pot and a non-perforated pot, he will accept the ruling of the sages to separate terumah in additional time. With regard to something that is in one container, he will not listen. He does not see any difference between receiving flour or dough, and he will not accept the ruling of the sages to separate challah an additional time. Consequently, they required him to return the flour. So someone's like, you can get, like, when the sages were debating whether to issue a rabbinic decree or not, right? Rabbinic decrees, Torah laws were, God created them. Some of them we understand, some of them we don't. Rabbinic decrees were not created for, fiat of the sages. They would always create a rabbinic decree to protect people from coming to violate a Torah law. That's the purpose of rabbinic decrees. So they were always thinking, how will this law land in the population? Will it create the desired effect to protect them from coming to make transgressions? Or will it just cause an undue burden that will actually result in people ignoring our decrees? Those kind of policy considerations were always a big part of creating rabbinic decrees. And if you wish, say that the Tana has a different concern. Actually, a priest will listen, even with regard to something in a single container, and the concern of the sages is that the prior owner of the flour will think that his dough has been made ready to eat, and he will come to eat it in its untithed state. So the Gemara asks, but didn't you say that a person knows that one may not separate challah from flour? Doesn't everybody know that? And the Gemara answers, well, he knows the law, but he does not know the reason for the law. Right? Now we're looking at the side of the giver as opposed to the side of the recipient priest. The person who's going to give challah as flour, right? He knows he's not supposed to do it, but why? He knows that one cannot separate challah from flour, but he does not know the reason. Because he thinks, what is the reason one may not separate challah from flour? It is due to the labor of the priest. And as far as the labor of the priest goes, this person thinks the priest has accepted that task upon himself. Right? If they say, hey, priest, can I give you your challah in the form of flour rather than dough? And the priest says, sure, because both of them are ignorant of the actual reason for the law. So they both assume that the reason that a priest normally would get at his dough is to save him the trouble of kneading the flour into dough. But that's not the reason. The reason it has to be given as dough is because that's what the Torah says. You would think that everyone knows that. But no, what everyone knows is how the custom has been handed down to them, and they might not be familiar with the scriptural source that led to it. The Gemara makes a suggestion based on a comparison to a similar case. But let it be terumah, i.e. challah, and he should separate terumah again. Didn't we learn in a similar idea in a Mishna? If one separated terumah from produce grown in a non-perforated pot for the produce of a perforated pot, it is terumah by rabbinic law. But he must separate terumah again to render the produce grown in the perforated pot ready to eat. And the Gemara answers, we have already established that with regard to things that are in two separate containers, this person will listen. But with regard to something that is in one container, he may not listen to the sages. The Gemara questions this assumption, and will one not listen to a ruling to separate terumah a second time from a single container? But didn't we learn in a Mishna, in the case of one who separated a cucumber as terumah to give to a priest, and that cucumber was found to be so bitter that it was inedible, or if he separated a melon and it was found to be spoiled, his separation is still terumah. It is not deconsecrated, only a priest can eat it, but this person must separate terumah again, because what he gave the priest was worthless. So the Gemara answers, well, there it is different, as it is full-fledged terumah by Torah law, and even if he does not listen and separate terumah again, no Torah law will be violated. What is the source from which it is extrapolated that it is a full-fledged terumah by Torah law? Very close to done. If you've got a question, please get it in. If one says... it is from a statement of Rabbi what is the source from which it is extrapolated that this terumah that turned out to be rotten is still terumah by Torah law? We learn this from a statement of Rabbi Eli. For Rabbi Eli says, from where is it derived? That one who separates terumah from poor quality produce in order to render superior quality produce tithed and ready to eat, that his terumah is terumah, as it is stated with regard to terumah, Numbers 18:32, and you shall bear no sin by reason of it, seeing that you have set apart from it the best thereof. The verse is saying, To give the best part is terumah, and one who gives a bad portion has committed a transgression. Nevertheless, the verse indicates that the separated produce is terumah. If it were not sacred as terumah, why would one bear a sin? If one's action were to no effect, he has not sinned. From here it is derived that if one separates terumah from poor quality produce in order to render superior quality produce tithed, then he has transgressed in that he should have separated terumah from the finest quality produce, but what he separated from the poor quality produce is terumah, and it remains terumah, and only a priest can eat of it. That's what I've got for us today. I'll take a couple of comments and questions, and we'll pick it up tomorrow, page 47a, at the regular Friday time of noon Pacific. And then it'll be Erev Sukkot. Wow. I got to get my esrog and I got to get my arba minim. I think maybe I'll go tonight to the store. Okay. Questions or comments? On Kiddushin 46. Here we go. Jonathan. I wonder if they waited to know if she was pregnant or not before deciding to marry if she was raped or seduced. Does the seducer still have responsibility to take care of the child even if they opted out of the marriage? Great question. I do not know the answer. I would think that if she's actually pregnant, they're probably going to just go ahead with the marriage, right? Because, this young girl who ends up pregnant, it's going to be hard for her to find a different husband. But definitely a bad and difficult situation, and I don't know the answer to your question. It's a good one. Tom, if the marriage doesn't happen, is there any punishment for the rapist? Absolutely. This is just one of his penalties. If he rapes a married woman, it's a death penalty offense, right? If he rapes, this unmarried woman, then his punishment is that he has to marry her and he never has the right to divorce her. But in addition to all of that, there's damages for hurting her, for humiliating her, medical costs, lost opportunity, the fine and penalty of the rapist, all kinds of other penalties. Here we were just discussing, does this create a betrothal and who has the right to get out of it? Sharon, when did the system change from the man paying the bride's father to what existed more recently where the father of the bride pays a dowry for a man to marry his daughter? I mean, there has to be a payment of money to create betrothal. But that's just because the Torah dictates that. I think even in ancient times, right, if the boy was considered a great match, right, and he wasn't going to marry unless a dowry was paid, that they could make that deal. It's just that he also had to give something of value. But, he might be giving, like a tiny little gold ring, worth $100, and the girl's father is giving to him, $1 million. Who knows what their relative values are. So I think that's much more, especially in a culture where these arranged marriages are much more than just about love and even compatibility and creating a successful family. It's also an economic situation, where two families are going to be joined, and there's a lot of other stuff at stake. So I would think that was always part of it, and which way the money's going, is just part of who's marrying who. In terms of the legal requirements for creating betrothal, I think that never changed, right? He has to give her or her father something of value. And Sharon also says, who does a priest give the challah to when they separate the challah? Yeah, I don't know. I'm guessing that he cannot give it to himself, so he probably has to give it to another priest. Maybe we'll encounter that law later. There are certain tractates of the Mishna that don't have a Gemara, so that's one of them. But maybe we'll encounter that law anyway, in a different tractate. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Friday, noon.